Marriage to an avoidant isn't simply a continuation of the dating relationship with added legal paperwork and shared living space. It's a fundamental shift that intensifies every challenge the avoidant attachment style creates, amplifies every pattern that caused difficulty during courtship, and exposes limitations that might have remained manageable when the relationship existed in a less committed form. The question isn't whether you love them or whether they love you. Love is often present in abundance. The question is whether you're prepared for the daily reality of being legally and practically bound to someone whose nervous system interprets sustained intimacy as threat, whose instinct when feeling engulfed is to withdraw, whose capacity for emotional presence may falter precisely when life demands it most. And equally important, is the avoidant prepared to confront their trauma in the context of marriage, where escape routes narrow, where their patterns impact not just a girlfriend or boyfriend, but a spouse and potentially children, where the consequences of their unaddressed wounds become more severe. Marriage doesn't fix avoidant attachment, it reveals it with stark clarity. The commitment doesn't heal the trauma. It creates conditions where the trauma must either be addressed seriously or where it will systematically erode the foundation of the partnership. Before entering this commitment, both parties need unflinching honesty about what marriage to an avoidant actually entails, what it will require from you, and whether the avoidant possesses genuine readiness to do the internal work that makes them capable of being a true partner, rather than someone who exists adjacent to partnership while maintaining emotional distance. The daily reality of living with avoidant patterns. The avoidant patterns that might have seemed manageable during dating become significantly more challenging in the context of marriage and cohabitation. When you were dating, the avoidant could retreat to their own space when intimacy felt overwhelming. They could decline to see you for days or weeks without consequence. They could maintain enough distance to keep their nervous system regulated. But marriage removes many of these escape mechanisms. You share a home, a bed, daily routines. The avoidant can't physically withdraw as easily, which means their emotional withdrawal becomes more pronounced. They might become unavailable while being physically present, existing in the same space but emotionally absent, going through motions of partnership without genuine engagement. The daily reality includes the avoidance need for excessive alone time that can make you feel like a roommate rather than a spouse. They might spend evenings in separate rooms, claim they need space after work before they can engage with you, or create routines that minimize interaction despite living together. This need for space isn't occasional or temporary. It's persistent, driven by the avoidance nervous system requirement for distance to feel safe. You find yourself living with someone who treats proximity as something to be managed rather than enjoyed, who seems to experience your presence as draining rather than nourishing, who needs recovery time from the simple act of being around you. The daily reality also includes the avoidance emotional unavailability during ordinary moments that require connection. When you want to share about your day, they offer minimal response or obvious disinterest. When you're excited about something, they can't match your enthusiasm. When you're struggling with difficulty, they provide practical solutions while remaining emotionally distant from your pain. This consistent failure to meet you emotionally creates profound loneliness within the marriage. You're not alone in the technical sense. You have a partner, a spouse, someone sharing your life, but you're alone in the ways that matter most, without genuine emotional companionship, without someone who can be present to your inner experience, without the intimate knowing that makes partnership feel meaningful. Living with avoidant patterns means adapting to a relationship where future planning is perpetually difficult. The avoidant resists conversations about long-term goals, about where you'll live, about whether and when to have children, about how you'll navigate major life transitions. These conversations trigger their claustrophobia about commitment, their fear of being trapped. their need to maintain the illusion of escape, even within marriage. You find yourself unable to make plans confidently because the avoidant won't commit to anything that feels too far in the future, won't engage seriously with discussions about shared goals, won't participate in building the kind of unified vision that makes a marriage feel like partnership rather than parallel existence. The daily reality includes the avoidance conflict avoidance that prevents problems from being addressed and resolved. When issues arise in the marriage, the avoidance instinct is to minimize them, deflect from them, or simply wait for them to dissipate without discussion. They resist conversations about relationship dynamics, become defensive when you raise concerns, or withdraw entirely when conflict emerges. This pattern means problems accumulate without resolution, resentments build without being aired, and the relationship slowly deteriorates because the maintenance work of addressing difficulties never happens. You're left choosing between suppressing your concerns to keep peace or raising them and facing the avoidance withdrawal. Living with avoidant patterns means experiencing your spouse's inconsistency in ways that create insecurity about the relationship's foundation. Some days, the avoidant is present and warm, engaged and affectionate. Other days, they're distant and cold, withdrawn and unavailable. This inconsistency isn't tied to external stresses or to anything you've done. It emerges from the avoidant's internal fluctuations in their capacity for intimacy. You wake up each day uncertain which version of your spouse you'll encounter, unable to predict whether today will be a day of connection or distance, forced to constantly adjust to their shifting availability without understanding what drives the changes. The daily reality also includes the avoidance relationship to physical intimacy, which often becomes another arena for their withdrawal patterns. Physical closeness might feel good to them in the moment, but afterwards they often need distance, experiencing the vulnerability of sexual intimacy as something to recover from rather than something that deepens bond. Or they might engage physically while remaining emotionally disconnected, using sex as a substitute for emotional intimacy rather than as an expression of it. You find yourself feeling used or lonely, even in physical closeness, because the emotional presence that would make the physical meaningful remains absent. Living with avoidant patterns means constantly second-guessing whether you're asking for too much, whether your needs are reasonable, whether you're being demanding by wanting things that should be basic features of marriage. The avoidant frames their limitations as boundaries and your needs as pressure, creating a dynamic where you feel guilty for wanting emotional presence, consistency, future planning, vulnerability. You internalize the message that you're too much, too needy, too demanding, when what you're actually asking for is the ordinary functioning of partnership. This internalization erodes your sense of self and your confidence in your own perceptions about what healthy relationship requires. The daily reality includes the avoidance tendency to keep you at arm's length emotionally, even while being committed to you legally. They share surface-level information, but keep their deeper fears, wounds, and vulnerabilities hidden. They present a managed version of themselves rather than allowing you to see them fully. This emotional guardedness means you're married to someone you don't fully know, someone who won't let you all the way in, someone who maintains privacy that feels less like healthy boundaries and more like walls that prevent genuine intimacy. You realize over time that marriage to an avoidant doesn't mean you've gained the deep knowing and access to their interior world that you expected partnership to provide. Living with avoidant patterns on a daily basis is exhausting in ways that aren't visible to others. Your marriage looks fine from the outside. You attend events together, you maintain your household, you function as a unit in social contexts. But the private reality is isolation, loneliness, constant adaptation to someone else's limitations, and the slow erosion of hope that the relationship will ever provide the intimacy and partnership you need. The daily reality of marriage to an avoidant is managing these patterns not occasionally, but constantly, not as temporary difficulties, but as permanent features of your shared life, not with the hope that they'll improve, but with the growing recognition that without serious intervention, this is what your marriage will be, indefinitely. The emotional labor that marriage to an avoidant requires. Marriage to an avoidant demands a level of emotional labor that exceeds what most partnerships require, labor that falls disproportionately on you as the non-avoidant partner. This labor is invisible, unacknowledged, and often unappreciated, yet it becomes the constant background work that keeps the marriage functioning. You become responsible not just for your own emotional well-being, but for managing the avoidant's discomfort with intimacy, for creating conditions where they feel safe enough to stay engaged, for walking the impossible tightrope between expressing your needs and triggering their withdrawal. This emotional labor is exhausting, unsustainable, and ultimately corrosive to your own sense of self. The emotional labor includes constantly monitoring and managing your own needs to keep them within the narrow range the avoidant can tolerate. You learn to suppress your desire for more emotional connection because expressing it makes them withdraw. You minimize your needs for reassurance because asking for it makes them defensive. You accept their minimal effort as though it's generous because demanding more triggers their retreat. This constant self-management requires you to betray yourself repeatedly, to treat your legitimate needs as problems to be minimized, to shrink yourself to fit within the limited space the avoidant can offer. The labor of this self-suppression accumulates over time, creating resentment, diminishing your vitality, and eroding your sense of worth. The emotional labor includes constantly interpreting the avoidant's behavior to determine what it means and how to respond. When they're distant, you spend energy trying to figure out if it's about you, about work stress, about their attachment patterns, or about something else entirely. When they withdraw, you calculate whether to give them space or to reach out. When they're cold, you analyze whether it's temporary or the beginning of a longer phase of disconnection. This constant interpretation work keeps your attention focused on them, on reading their moods and patterns, on trying to predict their behavior so you can adjust yours accordingly. The mental energy this requires is substantial and redirects focus from your own life to the project of managing theirs. The emotional labor includes being the relationship's sole emotional container, the person who holds space for both your feelings and theirs, who maintains awareness of the relationship's health, who notices problems and attempts to address them. The avoidant isn't doing this work. They're avoiding emotional awareness, minimizing relationship difficulties, deflecting from problems. You become the only one tracking the relationship's emotional reality, the only one concerned about its trajectory, the only one willing to engage in the difficult conversations that partnership requires. This one-sided emotional responsibility is exhausting because you're essentially doing relationship maintenance for two people while the avoidant benefits from that labor without contributing to it. The emotional labor includes managing the avoidant's discomfort with closeness by creating the illusion of distance within intimacy. You learn to be emotionally available while not seeming too available. You learn to express care while not overwhelming them with it. You learn to want them while not appearing needy. You learn to be present while giving them space. These contradictory requirements demand constant calibration, constant awareness of their comfort level, constant adjustment of your natural way of being in relationship to accommodate their limitations. The labor of maintaining this balance is cognitively and emotionally exhausting because it prevents you from ever relaxing fully into the relationship. The emotional labor includes protecting the avoidant from the consequences of their patterns. When they withdraw and it hurts you, you don't express the full extent of that hurt because you know it will make them withdraw further. When their inconsistency creates insecurity, you manage that insecurity internally rather than asking them to be more consistent. When their emotional unavailability leaves you lonely, you seek connection elsewhere rather than demanding they meet that need. This protection of the avoidant from facing what their behavior creates enables them to continue their patterns without confronting their impact. You absorb the pain rather than allowing it to reach them where it might motivate change. The emotional labor includes constantly explaining to others why your marriage looks the way it does. Friends and family notice the distance between you and your spouse, the lack of warmth in your interactions, the way you seem to function independently rather than as a couple. You find yourself defending the avoidant, explaining their patterns as personality quirks, minimizing the problems to outsiders while privately struggling with them. This external management of the marriage's image adds another layer of labor. You're not just managing the internal reality, but also managing how others perceive it, protecting the avoidance reputation while sacrificing opportunities to receive support and validation for what you're experiencing. The emotional labor includes the grief work you do privately about the relationship you hoped for versus the relationship you have. You grieve the intimacy that isn't present, the emotional partnership that doesn't exist, the future you imagined that probably won't materialize. This grief is ongoing rather than something you process once and complete. Each instance of the avoidance withdrawal, each conversation they won't have, each moment they're physically present but emotionally absent triggers fresh grief. The labor of managing this grief while maintaining the marriage, while showing up as a spouse, while continuing to function in daily life, is substantial and depleting. The emotional labor also includes maintaining your own mental health despite being in a relationship that consistently fails to meet your attachment needs. You might seek therapy, practice meditation, journal obsessively, or develop elaborate coping strategies to manage the anxiety, loneliness, and frustration the marriage creates. These self-care practices are necessary and valuable, but they're also labor, work you're doing to survive a relationship structure that fundamentally doesn't work for you. The fact that you need extensive external support and internal work to tolerate your own marriage is itself evidence of the unsustainability of the dynamic. The emotional labor of marriage to an avoidant ultimately raises the question of whether this level of work is what partnership should require. Healthy relationships do require effort, attention, and emotional engagement from both parties. But the labor in healthy partnerships is mutual and creates reciprocal benefit. The labor in marriage to an avoidant is one-sided and creates benefit primarily for the avoidant, who gets to maintain their comfortable distance while you do the work of keeping the relationship viable. Recognizing the extent of this labor is crucial before marriage because it won't decrease after the wedding. If anything, it intensifies as the commitment deepens and the stakes rise. The critical moments that will test the foundation. Marriage inevitably brings critical moments that test any relationship's foundation, but these moments are particularly revealing and challenging in marriage to an avoidant. These aren't the everyday difficulties of living with avoidant patterns. These are the major life events, crises, and transitions that require both partners to show up fully, to lean on each other, to face difficulty together. These moments expose whether the avoidant has the capacity to move beyond their patterns when circumstances demand it, or whether their attachment wounds render them unable to function as a true partner when you need them most. Understanding what happens during these critical moments helps you assess whether you're prepared for marriage to an avoidant and whether they're prepared to be the partner that marriage requires. The first critical test arrives when you face personal crisis, serious illness, loss of a loved one, professional failure, or any situation where you need genuine support and presence from your spouse. This is when you discover whether the avoidant can override their discomfort with emotional intensity and show up for you. Many avoidants fail this test catastrophically. When you're in crisis, your emotional need increases dramatically, and this increased need triggers the avoidance impulse to withdraw. Precisely when you need them most, they become least available. They might physically present themselves, but remain emotionally absent, offering practical help while being unable to sit with your pain. Or they might literally withdraw, finding reasons to be physically absent during your crisis, unable to tolerate the intensity of your emotional state. This failure during crisis creates a wound that doesn't easily heal. You learn in your most vulnerable moment that your spouse cannot be relied upon, that you're fundamentally alone, even within marriage, that the person who vowed to be your partner will disappear when things get difficult. This knowledge changes how you experience the marriage going forward. You stop turning to your spouse during difficulty because you've learned they won't meet you there. You develop independence not from strength, but from necessity, because dependence on the avoidant during crisis leads to abandonment when you're least equipped to handle it. The marriage becomes something you maintain during good times, while knowing you can't count on it during bad times. The second critical test comes with major life transitions, moving to a new city, changing careers, deciding about children, dealing with aging parents, or any shift that requires both partners to navigate uncertainty together. These transitions demand flexibility, communication, mutual support, and willingness to face the unknown as a team. The avoidant often fails these tests by becoming more rigid rather than more flexible, by withdrawing rather than engaging, by prioritizing their own stability over the partnership's needs. When the marriage faces transition, the avoidance instinct is to protect themselves from the additional stress and uncertainty rather than to join with you in facing it together. The decision about whether to have children represents a particularly significant test. If you want children and the avoidant is ambivalent or resistant, you face an impossible choice between your desire for family and your commitment to the marriage. But even if the avoidant agrees to children, the reality of parenthood will test their capacity in ways that dating and early marriage did not. Children require sustained presence, emotional availability, tolerance for neediness, and dependency. These requirements directly contradict the avoidance core patterns. Many avoidants become even more withdrawn after children arrive, overwhelmed by the increased demands, unable to show up for both partner and children, retreating further into work or solitude to escape the intensity of family life. Parenthood with an avoidant partner often means bearing disproportionate responsibility for childcare and emotional labor while your spouse remains peripherally involved. You become a single parent within a marriage, managing children's needs largely alone, while the avoidant maintains distance through work, hobbies, or simple unavailability. This dynamic damages not just your marriage, but also your children, who learn from the avoidant parent that emotional distance is normal, that needs should be minimized, that closeness is threatening. You watch your spouse repeat their attachment patterns with your children, creating the next generation of avoidant or anxiously attached individuals, and you face the painful question of whether staying in the marriage is harming your children, even as you try to give them an intact family. The third critical test involves conflict that can't be avoided or minimized, situations where the marriage's problems must be confronted directly. This might be infidelity, financial crisis, fundamental disagreement about major decisions, or accumulated resentment that finally demands address. These moments require both partners to engage vulnerably, to take responsibility for their contributions to problems, to communicate honestly even when it's uncomfortable, to work through difficulty rather than around it. The avoidant typically cannot meet this requirement. They deflect, minimize, blame, or withdraw entirely when forced to confront relationship dysfunction. They experience these necessary conversations as attacks, these moments of reckoning as punishment, these requests for accountability as demands they can't meet. When the marriage reaches a crisis point, where continuation requires the avoidant to change, to address their patterns, to do serious work on their attachment wounds, you discover whether they possess the capacity and willingness for transformation. Some avoidants, when faced with the genuine prospect of losing the marriage, finally commit to therapy, to examining their wounds, to doing the difficult work of developing more secure attachment. But many avoidants, even when faced with divorce, choose their patterns over the marriage. They'd rather lose the relationship than face the vulnerability that change requires. This choice reveals that their attachment to their defensive strategies is stronger than their attachment to you, that protecting themselves from the discomfort of growth is more important than preserving the partnership. The fourth critical test comes during moments when the marriage requires public acknowledgement and integration into broader life. This includes integrating with extended family, presenting yourselves as a couple in professional contexts, celebrating milestones together, or navigating social situations that require you to function as a unit. The avoidant often struggles with these moments because they require demonstrating commitment and intimacy publicly, which triggers their discomfort with being seen as part of a couple. They might keep you separate from important areas of their life, might fail to acknowledge the marriage's significance in professional contexts, might resist celebrating anniversaries or milestones, might seem uncomfortable displaying affection or connection in public. This compartmentalization creates a marriage that feels legitimate in private, but provisional in public, as though the avoidant is always maintaining escape routes, always keeping options open, always preserving the ability to present themselves as independent rather than partnered. You feel the instability this creates, the sense that the marriage isn't fully real because it isn't fully integrated into the avoidant's broader life. The test here is whether the avoidant can overcome their discomfort and claim the marriage publicly, integrating it into all aspects of their life, or whether they keep you in a separate box that doesn't touch their other identities and communities. The fifth critical test involves the inevitable moments when you reach your limit, when you can no longer tolerate the patterns, when you demand change or face leaving. These moments will come in marriage to an avoidant because the patterns are unsustainable. At some point, you'll recognize you can't continue living with emotional absence, with one-sided labor, with loneliness within partnership. The test is whether the avoidant can hear this ultimatum as a call to genuine transformation, or whether they experience it as proof that you're too demanding, that they were right to keep distance, that the marriage was a mistake. Their response to your breaking point reveals whether growth is possible or whether you're facing the end of a marriage to someone who cannot change enough to make partnership viable. These critical moments test not just the avoidance capacity, but also your own resilience, your willingness to continue in a marriage that consistently fails to meet your needs during the moments that matter most. Each test that the avoidant fails accumulates into a weight of disappointment, resentment, and recognition that you're not in the partnership you believed you were entering. The question becomes whether you're prepared to face these tests, knowing that the avoidant may fail them, whether you're willing to navigate crisis, transition, conflict, and breaking points largely alone while married to someone present in name, but absent in the ways that matter. Understanding these tests before marriage helps you assess honestly whether you're prepared for the reality of what you're committing to, and whether the avoidant has done the work necessary to pass these tests when they inevitably arrive. The question of whether the avoidant is ready for this commitment. Before you commit to marriage with an avoidant, The most crucial question isn't whether you're prepared to handle their trauma, it's whether they're prepared to confront it. Your preparation matters, but it's not sufficient. The avoidant must bring their own readiness to the commitment, their own willingness to do the work that marriage requires, their own capacity to function as a genuine partner, rather than someone who exists adjacent to partnership while maintaining emotional distance. Assessing the avoidant's readiness requires looking beyond their stated intentions and examining their actual behavior, their track record of addressing patterns, and their demonstrated capacity for sustained change rather than temporary adjustment. The avoidant's readiness can be assessed first by whether they've done serious work on their attachment wounds before marriage. Have they been in therapy addressing their patterns? Have they developed genuine insight into how their avoidance functions and what drives it? Have they identified the early experiences that created their attachment style and worked to heal those wounds? Or are they entering marriage believing their patterns are simply personality traits, that their limitations are fixed, that you need to accept them as they are without expecting growth? An avoidant who hasn't done this work before marriage is unlikely to do it after, when the escape of divorce becomes more difficult and costly than the escape routes they've relied on previously. The avoidance readiness is also revealed in how they've handled difficulty in the relationship leading up to marriage. When you've expressed hurt about their withdrawal, have they taken responsibility and worked to change the pattern? Or have they defended their behavior and blamed you for being too needy? When the relationship has faced stress, have they leaned in or pulled away? When you've needed them during difficulty, have they shown up or disappeared? The avoidance behavior during the relationship is the most reliable predictor of their behavior in marriage. If they haven't demonstrated capacity for sustained presence, emotional availability, and working through difficulty during dating, marriage won't magically create that capacity. The question of readiness includes whether the avoidant genuinely wants marriage or whether they're acquiescing to it because they fear losing you, because of external pressure, or because it's what they believe they should want. An avoidant who desires marriage for the wrong reasons will experience it as a trap they walked into knowingly, and this perception will intensify their need to create distance. You need to assess whether the avoidant is choosing marriage from genuine readiness for partnership or from fear, obligation, or the belief that committing will make their discomfort with commitment disappear. Spoiler: commitment doesn't resolve the fear of commitment. It often amplifies it. The avoidance readiness can be evaluated by examining whether they've developed the specific skills that marriage requires. Can they communicate about difficult topics without withdrawing? Can they handle conflict without defensiveness or stonewalling? Can they show up emotionally during crisis? Can they tolerate your full range of emotions without needing you to modulate them for their comfort? Can they make and keep commitments? Can they follow through on promises of change? These skills don't develop spontaneously in marriage. They must be cultivated before the wedding, and an avoidant who lacks them going into marriage will struggle catastrophically once the commitment is formalized. The readiness question also involves the avoidance relationship to their own feelings and needs. Have they developed enough emotional awareness to identify what they're feeling and express it? Can they distinguish between genuine boundary needs and avoidant withdrawal? Can they access vulnerability and share it with you? An avoidant who remains disconnected from their own emotional life cannot build genuine intimacy in marriage. They'll continue operating from their intellectual understanding of what relationship should be, while being unable to engage with the emotional reality of it. Marriage requires emotional presence, and an avoidant who hasn't developed that presence isn't ready for the commitment, regardless of their love for you. The avoidance readiness is also reflected in their willingness to prioritize the relationship over their comfort. Are they willing to stay present even when intimacy feels uncomfortable? Are they willing to have difficult conversations even when avoidance feels easier? Are they willing to show up during your crisis even when your emotional intensity triggers their withdrawal? An avoidant who consistently prioritizes their own comfort over the relationship's needs isn't ready for marriage because marriage will require them to tolerate discomfort repeatedly. If they haven't demonstrated this willingness during dating, they're unlikely to suddenly develop it after the wedding. The question of readiness includes whether the avoidant has realistic understanding of what marriage entails. Do they understand that marriage means decreased independence, increased obligation, sustained intimacy? Do they recognize that their patterns will be tested and that those tests will require them to function differently than they have in the past? Or do they believe marriage will be essentially like dating, but with a legal document and shared living space? Avoidants who don't understand what marriage actually requires are unprepared for it, and their shock when reality doesn't match their expectations often triggers intensified withdrawal and regret about the commitment. The avoidance readiness can be assessed by whether they've developed capacity for interdependence rather than just independence. Can they rely on you and allow you to rely on them? Can they share decision-making and future planning? Can they build shared life while maintaining individual identity? Interdependence is the foundation of functional marriage, and an avoidant who can only operate independently or who experiences any dependency as threatening isn't prepared for partnership. Marriage requires mutual reliance, and an avoidant who hasn't developed comfort with this will experience the marriage as suffocating, regardless of how much space you try to provide. The question of readiness also involves the avoidant's motivation for change. Are they addressing their patterns because they genuinely want to develop capacity for secure attachment? Or are they managing their patterns just enough to keep you from leaving? The former creates foundation for potential growth. The latter creates temporary behavioral changes that will revert to old patterns once the marriage is secure and the threat of losing you diminishes. You need to assess whether the avoidant is committed to transformation or simply to maintenance, whether they want to heal their wounds or just to manage them enough that you stop complaining about their impact. The final and perhaps most important aspect of assessing the avoidant's readiness is whether they understand that readiness isn't static. It requires ongoing commitment to growth throughout the marriage. Are they willing to continue therapy, to keep examining their patterns, to stay engaged with the work of developing more secure attachment, not just until the wedding, but for years afterward? Marriage to an avoidant requires the avoidant to stay in active recovery from their attachment wounds, to keep choosing growth over comfort, to keep prioritizing the relationship over their defensive strategies. An avoidant who believes the work ends at the wedding or who isn't committed to ongoing growth will gradually revert to their baseline patterns, and the marriage will slowly deteriorate into the dynamic you're trying to prevent. Ultimately, the question of whether you should marry an avoidant depends less on whether you're prepared to handle their trauma and more on whether they're prepared to finally address it seriously. Your preparation, resilience, and capacity for emotional labor matter, but they cannot compensate for the avoidant's lack of readiness. Marriage to an unprepared avoidant becomes a slow-motion tragedy, where you sacrifice yourself trying to make partnership work with someone fundamentally unable or unwilling to be a partner. The most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the avoidant is to require demonstrated readiness before marriage, to refuse to commit until the avoidant has proven through sustained behavior change that they've developed the capacity marriage requires. This means potentially delaying or declining marriage, accepting that the relationship might end rather than proceeding into a commitment that will damage both of you. It means trusting that if the avoidant is genuinely ready, they'll do the work and prove it through action, rather than just words. And it means accepting that you cannot love someone into readiness. cannot wait patiently enough for readiness to develop, cannot sacrifice enough of yourself to make up for the avoidance lack of preparation. Marriage to an avoidant who isn't ready is a recipe for profound suffering, and recognizing this truth before the wedding is the most important assessment you can make, more important than your feelings for them, more important than the time already invested, more important than fear of starting over with someone new. The question isn't whether you love them enough to marry them despite their avoidance. The question is whether they've addressed their avoidance enough to be capable of the sustained intimacy, presence, and partnership that marriage requires. Without honest assessment of their readiness, you're not entering a marriage. You're entering a more binding version of the same dynamics that have caused difficulty throughout the relationship, now with higher stakes, more difficult exit, and greater potential for damage to both parties as patterns play out within the constrained structure of legal and social commitment.